Whoa, what is this? A hoplite video? I thought that guy was dead. No such luck, folks. Welcome back to the channel. After a long and I will say much needed hiatus, we are back. And we are back to see COVID-19, the Great Reset, Part 2. That's right. Okay. Yeah, I apologize for my unannounced and extended absence. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I saw that I had not posted in over a month, and I needed to get back in the swing of things, so here we are. And we are here to continue in our Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, The Great Reset series of books, and we're on book 2, COVID-19, The Great Reset. And it's ironic because, the World Economic Forum just had their annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. I believe it concluded last week. And not as many people attended this year, I understand it. The World Economic Forum is kind of getting a bad rap. It's getting a bad name. 5-10 years ago, it was very prestigious. Only the elite of the elite attended. And now it's becoming somewhat of a joke. A lot of world leaders, failed to RSVP, as it were. So who knows? Maybe the tide is turning and people are starting to see through the grand designs of this organization and its figurehead. But only time will tell. In the meantime, we are going to discuss this book, as we had in part 1, and talk a little bit more about what Mr. Klaus Schwab believes is necessary for the world in order for more cohesion and more progress to be made, and why the COVID-19 pandemic, as he saw it, was an opportunity, if you can believe that, for a great reset and for this greater world design to take shape. And we're living it right now. It's 2023. This book was written in June of 2020. So we're going to read his words here and see how prescient or perhaps even prophetic he was, if at all. But before that, let's go through the timeline again, because I started the first episode way back over a month and a half ago, talking about the timeline of COVID as it progressed and as it became more or less endemic and moved from a pandemic to, it's everywhere in the world now. There was no stopping it after a certain point. But how did we react to it? What did we do? And how did we get to where we are today? I stopped the timeline in part 1 with the publication of this book. So naturally for part 2, I'm going to pick up where I left off. And I decided, since this book is a little bit longer than his other 2 works, even though it's quite redundant, I'm going to make COVID-19, The Great Reset, a 4-part series. So we'll do 4 parts for this book, and I believe The Great Narrative I can probably do in 3, but we'll see. So this will be a 4-parter. So we'll be halfway through after this episode. Anyway, as we saw in July of 2016, Mr. Schwab published this book. It's a little bit presumptuous of him, wouldn't you say, that he decides to publish a book about a previously unknown and novel virus and says, well, I'm going to let you know how it's all going to go, as maybe someone who possibly foresaw this would do. Hypothetical. September 28th of 2020, a couple months after the publication, worldwide COVID-19 death toll is about 1 million. Again, I'm getting this timeline from the US CDC, which, if you ask me, is probably not the most reputable organization, considering what's come to light over the last 2 years. But nevertheless, they say 1 million people worldwide by September 28th of 2020 had died from COVID as a, direct result from COVID. Next month, October 2nd, 2020, President Trump tested positive for COVID, and he's treated with remdesivir, which I believe is some a high-strength antiviral drug. And I don't know necessarily if they're still using remdesivir to treat people. I do remember President Trump, though, there was some ceremony where he was present at, and you could see him. He was, standing there trying to be stoic and strong, and you could see his chest kind of, heaving under his suit, like he was struggling to breathe, obviously. So he was definitely going through some sort of respiratory illness. But President Trump at the time, I believe, was 72 or 73, maybe. The guy eats like he's a high school student, doesn't exercise outside, doesn't exercise anywhere except the golf course. So for a 75-year-old guy who eats junk food all day and doesn't work out, he made it, right? He survived it. You think if anybody was going to get killed by this thing, it would be a guy who eats pizza, French fries, and hamburgers every day, and hasn't seen a treadmill since he was in college. But be that as it may, he popped out for COVID in October, and I want to say by November he was cleared. Speaking of November, on the 16th, Moderna has found that its own vax is 95% effective against COVID-19, which I think we later found out was complete bunk. But Moderna told us our vaccine is 95% effective. You could take it to the bank. December 11th. Okay, now this date, to borrow a phrase from FDR, should go down in infamy. FDA grants an emergency use authorization for the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, which it had also been developing alongside Moderna. So the FDA grants emergency use authorization for a vaccine that could not have been developed beyond 9 months. So you have a vaccine that's now being given to people under emergency use that has only gone through approximately 8 to 9 months of testing. Just so you're aware, and you can look this up on, I think it's clinicalpub.gov or edu, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the one that maybe you have taken or somebody who has taken it, it's still in phase 1 of clinical trials, and that clinical trial, the first phase, does not conclude until May of 2023. So this vaccine, as far as the FDA clinical trials, the old school, tried and true, no EUA BS, that clinical trial, first phase, doesn't conclude for another 5 months. And just so you know, the vast majority of vaccines that go through clinical trials don't make it past phase 1 or phase 2. If a vaccine's in phase 3, that's kind of like working out the kinks before it goes mainstream. Phase 3, that's like to basically double check everything. The majority of vaccines don't make it past phase 1 and definitely phase 2. Pfizer doesn't even have its vaccine in phase 2 yet. But what happened? December 18th, a week later, FDA grants an EUA for the Moderna vaccine. Same deal. December 23rd of 2020, right before Christmas, the Trump admin gave us a present and announced that they purchased 100 million Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines on our behalf with our money. Thank you very much, President Trump. And December 31st, 2020, New Year's Eve, 2.8 million Americans have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, be it Moderna, J&J, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, what have you. I don't think AstraZeca is in the United States, though. It's possible. I do know Moderna and Pfizer for sure, obviously, and I believe J&J may have been inside this timeline or maybe later. Don't quote me on that. But 2.8 million Americans decided to sign up for a vaccine that the FDA granted emergency use authorization, and it only had between 8 to 9 months of data behind it. And 2.8 million Americans just said, I don't know about COVID, but I trust the science, I trust the medicine, I trust the FDA, I trust the CDC, I trust the HHS, and 2.8 million Americans got the needle put in their arm. They projected 20 million Americans would actually volunteer for this. So they were 18 million people short, roughly, of anticipated, I'm not going to say guinea pigs, volunteers who decided to take a vaccine that, as I said, is still today, 3 years later, in phase 1 of its clinical trials. And as I said, the majority of vaccines, of any medicines, don't make it past phase 1 and phase 2. And even if they do, something like 33%, don't quote me on that figure either, I don't know why that's in my head, of vaccines and medicines that are approved and do make it through clinical trials are recalled from the market anyway because new data comes up or some unforeseen consequence happens and they have to be pulled off the market. But nevertheless, this was a pandemic. Klaus Schwab told us about it back in July, and the vaccine rolled out, and this is how 2020 played out from halfway through the year until the New Year's Eve. Okay, I'll pick up with 2021 for part 3. But let's get to the text here, and we'll read from the man himself, Klaus Schwab. And you'll find it kind of interesting that these readings don't really talk a whole lot about COVID-19 itself. It kind of talks as COVID being like the linchpin for all these other issues and why COVID will kickstart all of this societal change and what it's all going to mean in the future. It makes you feel like COVID is just kind of like the icebreaker of the conversation. But the book itself, which I said is like 250 some pages, is 95 to 99% about something other than COVID. But anyway, let's begin with this episode on page 51. This is under the macro reset section. I think it's under economic growth still. And Klaus said, in testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking on May 19th, the Federal Reserve System's chairman, Jerome Powell, confessed, this precipitous drop in economic activity has caused a level of pain that is hard to capture in words, as lives are upended amid great uncertainty about the future. In just the 2 months of March and April 2020, more than 36 million Americans lost their jobs, reversing 10 years of job gains. In the U.S., like elsewhere, temporary dismissals caused by the initial lockdowns may become permanent, inflicting intense social pain that only robust social safety nets can alleviate, and profound structural damage on countries' economies. Okay, so yeah, right there, I just said this book is about COVID-19, but it's mostly about the Great Reset. This is the icebreaker, right? This gets you into the theater, but the show is about something else. And here he's talking about Jerome Powell, who is still the Fed Reserve Chairman as of 2023, and what's going on. Everybody's talking about the recession, which we're basically living through right now. They haven't made it official, but we're going into a recession. The United States is, and I think the world is as well. But he's talking about 36 million Americans losing their jobs in the first half of 2020, wiping out all of the gains of the previous 10 years. What does that sound like to you? Sounds like a great reset to me, doesn't it? Here we have this virus, newly discovered. People are terrified of it, but we still can't get past the fact that 99% of people who are afflicted with it get over it without any long-term complications within 2 weeks. Do you think that was good enough reason for 36 million Americans to lose their jobs? I don't. Now we have the consequences of what that meant. It was the government printing trillions upon trillions of dollars, locking people down in their homes, telling them they can't go to the grocery store, they can't go to the bar, they can't go to the restaurant, they can't see their grandmother, et cetera, but don't worry, stay home and the check's in the mail. Now what? Well, now we have trillions upon trillions of dollars that are just out there in circulation, and it's inflating our currency. And we're entering a recession. And it's going to be stagflation if we have a recession with continued inflation. So what do? We're going to raise interest rates. Okay, well, try to tell people you're going to raise interest rates on them now after, I don't know how many years we had like 0% interest rates. People are just going to wake up one day and see that everything is more expensive, everything comes with a higher percentage rate, and they're going to ask, well, why the hell do we go through all of that in the pandemic if this is our economic future? If this is our economic future for all of that, like you're compounding the fact that we all were locked down, people were getting sick, none of the measures that we took really made a damn bit of difference, and now we have a recession 3 years later on top of it, possibly a depression if things get really worse. Yeah, that's basically what happened. It was pain, and the remedy was more pain. All right, continuing. We jump to page 54. Klaus wrote, "In the coming months, the unemployment situation is bound to deteriorate further for the simple reason that it cannot improve significantly until a sustainable economic recovery begins. This won't happen before a vaccine or a treatment is found, meaning that many people will be doubly worried about losing their job and about not finding another one if they do lose it, which will lead to a sharp increase in savings rates. In a slightly more distant time, from a few months to a few years, two categories of people will face a particularly bleak employment situation. Young people entering for the first time a job market devastated by the pandemic and workers susceptible to be replaced by robots. These are fundamental issues at the intersection of economics, society, and technology with defining implications for the future of work. Automation, in particular, will be a source of acute concern. The economic case that technology always exerts a positive economic effect in the long term is well known. The substance of the argument goes like this. Automation is disruptive, but it improves productivity and increases wealth, which in turn lead to greater demands for goods and services and thus to new types of jobs to satisfy those demands. This is correct, but what happens between now and the long term? In all likelihood, the recession induced by the pandemic will trigger a sharp increase in labor substitution, meaning that physical labor will be replaced by robots and intelligent machines, which in turn provoke lasting and structural changes in the labor market. In the technology chapter, we analyze in more detail the impact the pandemic is having on automation, but there's already ample evidence that accelerating the pace of transformation. The call center sector epitomizes this situation. In the pre-pandemic era, new AI-based technologies were being gradually introduced to automate some of the tasks performed by human employees. The COVID-19 crisis and its accompanying measures of social distancing has suddenly accelerated this process of innovation and technological change. Chatbots, which often use the same voice recognition technology behind Amazon's Alexa and other software that can replace tasks normally performed by human employees, are being rapidly introduced. These innovations, provoked by necessity, i.e. sanitary measures, will soon result in hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of job losses. Okay, gonna throw the BS flag right there, Klaus. This economic recession that we're currently living through was not caused by the pandemic. I'll tell you that flat out. The pandemic did not cause all of these job losses. The pandemic did not cause the ensuing recession that took place as a result of everyone locking down, everyone getting money for free, and the money printer going burr. Man did that. We did that. Our governments did that. It was not the pandemic, okay? As I said, over 99% of people who ever got COVID got over it in 2 weeks without any long-term lasting effects. Did people get sick with COVID and die? Yes. Did those people have pre-existing comorbidities? Also yes. The fact that we shut down our economies, our lives, and he's saying now that this jumpstarts the AI industry, what he's saying to you is, no, COVID-19 is a good thing because it starts the Great Reset. We build new companies, and those new companies build new robots, and those robots replace you. And who does he mean by you? He means low skill, low IQ, low wage workers. Why would I pay Randy, Cindy, and Jerome to flip burgers and to put fries in a basket when I can plug a machine into a wall? It has 8 arms like an octopus, and it can flip burgers, cook fries, and take orders all at the same time. And all it's going to cost me is the purchasing of that robot and the electricity it runs on in the wall. Why would I pay 3 people a wage per day to do that when they're going to get sick, they're going to get lazy, they're not going to do it as well as the robot because the robot is programmed to do the exact same thing every single time without fail. This Great Reset is being introduced, but it's okay because, well, this Great Reset via AI took place because it was necessary, because of the pandemic, you see. You stayed home while companies built new products and new robots to replace you. But you got that check, right? You got that stimmy check in the mail. The stimmy check was nice. $500 here, $500 there. Okay, pandemic's over. Now what happens? You go to McDonald's and there are kiosks. I've been to one. Not that I go to McDonald's that often, and you shouldn't either, but there are kiosks in the middle of these McDonald's now, and you can just order right there off the touch screen. They're already eliminating the frontline jobs at a McDonald's or a fast food restaurant where you have to talk to somebody and order off the menu and they punch it in, and then it goes back to the guy who's flipping the burgers or the girl who's, tossing the fry basket. It goes straight back to the cooks. And if you think the cook's job is safe, as I just said, why would I need a cook if I can hire somebody to build me a robot with 8 arms that can flip burgers like 500 per minute? They lulled you into this sleep thinking that, well, it's for your safety. Everybody's got to get vaccinated. We all got to lock down. And it's going to generate this whole new fourth industrial revolution of AI and robotic job replacement. I bet the question you're probably asking yourself, if you're like me, is if we replace all these people with robots, what are all these people going to do all day? Some people might say that's what the vaccine was for, but I'm not going to say that. Let's read on. Jump to page 60. Additionally, several institutions and organizations ranging from cities to the European Commission are reflecting on options that would sustain future economic activity at a level that matches the satisfaction of our material needs with the respect of our planetary boundaries. The municipality of Amsterdam is the first in the world to have formally committed to this framework as a starting point for public policy decisions in the post-pandemic world. The framework resembles a donut in which the inner ring represents the minimum we need to lead a good life, as enunciated by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the outer ring, the ecological ceiling defined by Earth system scientists, which highlights the boundaries not to be crossed by human activity to avoid environmentally negative impact on climate, soils, oceans, ozone layer, freshwater, and biodiversity. In between the two rings is the sweet spot, or the dough, where our human needs and those of the planet are being met. We do not know yet whether the tyranny of GDP growth will come to an end, but different signals suggest that the pandemic may accelerate changes in many of our well-entrenched social norms. If we collectively recognize that beyond a certain level of wealth defined by GDP per capita, happiness depends more on intangible factors such as accessible healthcare and a robust social fabric than on material consumption, then values as different as the respect for the environment, responsible eating, empathy, or generosity may gain ground and progressively come to characterize the new social norms. Okay, I think I mentioned this in my first part to this, that word, the new normal, right? I was so sick of hearing that because it just sounded like just psychobabble crap, and it is. The new normal, right? This is the new norm. There are new social norms. And it's like, no, there are not. Like the social norms that you and I enjoyed a year before COVID are still there. You're trying to introduce a new way of doing things, but calling it normal, so we accept it. This idea of the tyranny of GDP growth, what does that sound like to you? Some might say it sounds like communism. I would agree. This tyranny of GDP growth is kind of what built the first world. I hate to tell you this, but GDP growth is the bottom line as it applies to capitalist societies. Capitalist societies, while not fair, create first world living conditions because people are free to explore whatever craft or hobby or profession or calling they want, and they get to compete with other people. And the person who produces the best good or service in that field wins. But then everybody wins, right? We get the best TV, we get the best cars, we get the best built homes, we get the best organic food, etc. That's how it works. But here he's talking about beyond a certain level of wealth defined by GDP per capita, happiness depends more on intangible factors such as accessible healthcare and robust social fabric. He's setting up the narrative that you're going to accept UBI and you're going to accept universal healthcare, and that's all you're going to need. You're going to need $1,000 check in the mail every month. And you're going to have free healthcare on demand. And that's all you're going to need in life. Here's $1,000. Here's free healthcare. Go play. It's conditioning you to accept a reset, a new normal, that because of COVID, everybody needs access to quality healthcare. Everybody needs access to regular income, because what if we have to lock down again and a pandemic worse than COVID comes around, which I think might, and people have to go through the exact same thing? Can we afford millions upon millions of people losing their jobs again? Will this create social unrest? Maybe we should just give people free money and just make that like their morphine drip. And they'll just, float through life in this morphine haze. Like, hey, whatever, I don't care. I'll lock down. I'll stay at home. I got health care, right? Okay, good. I got $1,000. All right. I can buy my grasshopper burger. I can play my Xbox or PS5. What more do I need? Oh, you want me to live in a 500 square foot apartment for the rest of my life? Will I get to bring my Xbox or my PS5? Will I have a fridge for my grasshopper burgers? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll do it. Like, this is conditioning people to accept this now. Because in the future, he's basically hinting at the fact that you might not have a job in the future because nobody's going to hire you when they can, like I said, buy the robot. And this is going to be like the brave new world, right? We don't need people working. We've got robots to do everything. We don't need people to reproduce anymore. We make babies in a lab, and we select out this gene or this abnormality. So sex is now just for recreation. You can pop a pill. In the book, it's called Soma, but it'll be UBI and grasshopper burgers in the future until it's something new. That's what's going on. That's what this book is about. It's not about this. It's about that. This is just like, whoa, I got to read that because that's here and now. This is the future. That's what he's saying. And that's what's being illustrated in these chapters. I hope you're paying attention. All right, let's move on to the next reading. This is page 64. Klaus wrote, "Some have called for degrowth, a movement that embraces zero or even negative GDP growth that is gaining some traction, at least in rich countries. As the critique of economic growth moves to center stage, consumerism's financial and cultural dominance in public and private life will be overhauled. This is made obvious in consumer-driven degrowth activism in some niche segments like advocating for less meat or fewer flights. By triggering a period of enforced degrowth, the pandemic has spurred renewed interest in this movement that wants to reverse the pace of economic growth, leading more than 1,100 experts from around the world to release a manifesto in May of 2020, putting forward a degrowth strategy to tackle the economic and human crises caused by COVID-19. Their open letter calls for adoption of a democratically planned, yet adaptive, sustainable, and equitable downscaling of the economy, leading to a future where we can live better with less. However, beware of the pursuit of degrowth proving as directionless as the pursuit of growth. The most forward-looking countries and their governments will instead prioritize a more inclusive and sustainable approach to managing and measuring their economies, one that also drives job growth, improvements in living standards, and safeguards the planet. The technology to do more with less already exists. There is no fundamental trade-off between economic, social, and environmental factors if we adopt this more holistic and longer-term approach to defining progress and incentivizing investment in green and social frontier markets." Okay. Full disclosure, I don't know what the hell a social frontier market is. He creates these very like comfortable and cozy sounding phrases, like a social frontier market. Well, that sounds really nice. Like Facebook and is a social network. Maybe the social frontier market will be like that. I know what a green frontier market is, and that's basically convincing you to drive an electric car and to give up eating meat, which he also mentions here, right? Like advocating for less meat and fewer flights. Again, degrowth. Okay, there's a word for that. It's called atrophy. Okay, degrowth. That sounds stupid, as it should. Atrophy is when you lose growth, you shrink, right? If you stop going to the gym and training muscles, your muscles recognize that lack of stimulation and they shrink. There's atrophy, right? Hypertrophy is when you gain muscle, is when you grow by eating and exercising and lifting and building muscle. Atrophy is what he's talking about. He's talking about atrophy for the world economy. And I don't know, under like 1,100 experts all agree that that might be a good thing. No, that sounds like a terrible thing. The story of human life and human evolution is progress. It's growth. It is going here where before we had never visited, right? It is doing something that has never been yet done. It is exploring and inventing new fields of science or new endeavors that humankind had not yet explored. That is growth, right? It is to take the human condition and move it up a notch, if not several, right? That's the purpose of human evolution. That's the purpose of human life, is to, I think so, is to at least take what we have and hand it to the next generation in at least the same condition, if not better than where we found it. This degrowth, this atrophy of economies or negative growth, that's telling the future generations, you're not going to have it as good as I am. But don't worry, that's good because, well, COVID-19, right? This is just something we have to do. And maybe if you took less plane rides and ate less steak and lived in smaller, dwellings, maybe that would be better for everybody if you did that. Me, well, I got to do all that stuff, right? I bought steak when I felt like it. I hopped on a flight when it was convenient. And your mom and I, we bought that 5-bed, 4-bath house and lived on 10 acres. And, that was sweet. But, for you guys, because of COVID, maybe it's better if you just, live in your high-rise apartment in a densely populated city. You don't own a car, and steak isn't on the menu anymore. How does that sound? Like it's telling people that possibly the future will be a place of degrowth or atrophy. And in my mind, that's the opposite of what we should be going for. But it's being sold to people as a social frontier or a green frontier. And them going through that kind of a lifestyle adjustment will be good for everybody. So it's good for you too. It's collectivism. Again, don't care for it. Moving on. Page 72. This is under the fate of the US dollar. Oh, this should be a good one. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of retaining the global reserve currency, a status that has long been a perk of imperial might and economic elixir. To a considerable extent, American power and prosperity have been built and reinforced by the global trust in the dollar and the willingness of customers abroad to hold it, most often in the form of U.S. government bonds. The fact that so many countries and foreign institutions want to hold dollars as a store of value and as an instrument of exchange has anchored its status as the global reserve currency. This has enabled the U.S. to borrow cheaply abroad and benefit from low interest rates at home, which in turn has allowed Americans to consume beyond their means. It has also made large recent U.S. government deficits possible, permitted the U.S. to run substantial trade deficits, reduced the exchange rate risk, and made the U.S. financial markets more liquid. At the core of the U.S. dollar status as a reserve currency lies a critical issue of trust. Non-Americans who hold dollars trust that the U.S. will protect both its own interests by managing sensibly its economy and the rest of the world as far as the U.S. dollar is concerned, by managing sensibly its currency, like providing dollar liquidity to the global financial system efficiently and rapidly. For quite some time, some analysts and policymakers have been considering a possible and progressive end to the dominance of the dollar. They now think that the pandemic might be the catalyst that proves them right. Their argument is twofold and relates to both sides of the trust issue. On the one hand, managing the economy sensibly, doubters of the U.S. dollar dominance point to the inevitable and sharp deterioration of the U.S. fiscal position. In their mind, unsustainable levels of debt will eventually erode confidence in the US dollar. Just prior to the pandemic, US defense spending plus interest on the federal debt plus annual entitlement payments, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, represented 112% of federal tax receipts versus 95% in 2017. This unsustainable path will worsen in post-pandemic, post-bailout era. This argument suggests that something major will therefore have to change, either through a much reduced geopolitical role or higher taxation or both. Otherwise, the rising deficit will reach a threshold beyond which non-US investors are unwilling to fund it. After all, the status of reserve currency cannot last longer than foreign confidence in the ability of the holder to honor its payments. On the other hand, managing the US dollar sensibly for the rest of the world, doubters of the dollar's dominance point to the incompatibility of its status as a global reserve currency with rising economic nationalism at home. Even though the Fed and the US Treasury manage the dollar and its influential network worldwide with efficacy, skeptics emphasize that the willingness of the US administration to weaponize the US dollar for geopolitical purposes, like punishing countries and companies that trade with Iran or North Korea, will inevitably incentivize dollar holders to look for alternatives. Okay, I'm halfway through this passage, but I want to stop here because this passage, more than any, is so relevant to today in the here and now. Listen to that last section, the last sentence there. The U.S. Treasury and the Fed manage the dollar and its influential network worldwide with efficacy. Some might doubt that. Skeptics emphasize that the willingness of the U.S. administration to weaponize the U.S. dollar for geopolitical purposes, like punishing countries and companies that trade with Iran and North Korea, will inevitably incentivize dollar holders to look for alternatives. Here, Klaus is being prophetic. What's going on right now in the world still? We have the war in Ukraine. And I might do another episode on the war in Ukraine, but after what happened in Bakhmut and what's happening in Soledar, I still believe that the Russian Federation is going to win that war, and they always were. But what has the West done in the last year to Russia? It has tried to punish Russia, its allies, and even its like individual private citizens with sanctions to the point where it's ludicrous. They're trying to seize people's yachts. I want to say that the Russian economy has been sanctioned by the US and NATO more so than any other country since World War II. And what is it doing? It is galvanizing all of the countries that are sick and tired of living and dying by the US dollar to pool their resources and come up with an alternative. And the BRICS coalition, which would be Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have now expanded. I believe Saudi Arabia is talking about joining BRICS. I think that's more or less a done deal. Countries like Venezuela, Iran, of course. There's another country, Nigeria, perhaps. These countries that no longer want to live under the hegemony of the US dollar see what's being done to Russia, and they don't like it because they might think, well, I could be next. If I run afoul of the US government, they're going to weaponize the dollar that they're forcing me to hold against me. Why don't I just ditch the dollar and we go on a digital ruble, which is happening, or a digital yuan? Or maybe we all come up with our own digital currencies, our central bank digital currencies in our individual countries, but we interchange these currencies among our friendly nations, and we exclude the US dollar. We have central bank digital currencies in our own countries, and we exchange among our banks within the BRICS coalition. If Saudi Arabia goes off the petrodollar, which I believe is kind of a done deal. I mean, we haven't seen it officially happen yet, but they've essentially announced that they're going to exchange Saudi crude on the Shanghai market in China using the yuan, which would be the first time in over 50 years that that's happened. Prior to that, since 1971, when we got off the gold standard, the agreement was the Saudis would trade in Saudi Arabian crude with the US and the rest of the world, but they would do it on US dollars only, meaning you had to hold US currency to get Saudi crude. What did that do? That increased the demand for the US dollar. And unfortunately, the US experienced one of the biggest booms in its economic history, but it made us drunk and arrogant. And we just taxed and we spent and we taxed and we spent. So much so, like as he said, 112% of our debts, 112% of our tax receipts are based on entitlements and defense spending. Meaning we're spending, well, in 2017, it was 95%. God knows what it is now. This was 2020, 112%. It's like you're spending $1.12 and you're making $1, which means you're 12 cents in the hole every single time. Of course, exponentially increase this to the trillions of dollars. That's the US debt. We are so far into debt, there's almost like no going back now. And when these countries get off the US dollar, well, if you thought we were in a recession now, wait until that day happens. That means there will be quadrillions of US dollars possibly in circulation that no longer have to be used by the countries that we forced to hold them, which means all that debt gets called in. All of that money is no longer moving. There is no more liquidity. And the US dollar overnight would just crater. And then it gets ugly in the United States. Believe me, we haven't seen desperation and panic like that since the 1930s in the United States, where you wake up one day and the dollar you're holding in your hand might not even be worth the paper it's printed on. It could be that bad. Okay, continuing. Klaus says, are there any viable alternatives? The U.S. remains a formidable global financial hegemon. The role of the dollar in international financial transactions is far greater, albeit less visible than in international trade. But it is also true that many countries would like to challenge the dollar's global dominance. In the short term, there are no alternatives. The Chinese renminbi could be an option, but not until strict capital controls are eliminated and the RMB turns into a market-determined currency, which is unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. The same goes for the euro. It could be an option, but not until doubts about a possible implosion of the eurozone dissipate for good, which again is an unlikely prospect in the next few years. As for a global virtual currency, there is none in sight yet, but there are attempts to launch national digital currencies that may eventually dethrone the US dollar's supremacy. The most significant one took place in China at the end of April of 2020, with a test of a national digital currency in 4 large cities. The country is years ahead of the rest of the world in developing a digital currency combined with powerful electronic payment platforms. This experiment clearly shows that there are monetary systems that are trying to become independent from US intermediaries while moving towards greater digitization. Ultimately, the possible end of the US dollar's primacy will depend on what happens in the US. As Henry Paulson, a former US Treasury Secretary, said, US dollar prominence begins at home. The US must maintain an economy that inspires global credibility and confidence. Failure to do so will, over time, put the US dollar's position in peril. Well, Hank Paulson called it, the US dollar is in peril because we are losing this global credibility and confidence. Because in response to COVID-19, we decided to print our money like it was going out of style. The money printer went burr and it kept going burr. And now you have a war in Ukraine. You have the United States trying to punish a world power like Russia for trying to control its backyard and not allowing NATO to encroach further via Ukraine. And now we try to sanction them. Like we can punish them with our trillions and trillions of dollars that we printed. Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa have all got together and said, listen, the dollar's supremacy has to go because this isn't fair. And the United States has enjoyed this position for far too long. It wields significant economic strength and military strength, but we can break the back of its economic strength if we just coalesce around our own digital currencies, and that our digital currencies are what we use to trade within our sphere. And we can exclude the dollar, and they have to come to us. And these digital currencies in 2020 seem far off, but I got to tell you something, they're here today. China has a digital yuan. Russia has a digital ruble. that will become the new standard of trade for those countries. India is developing one. And I'm positive South Africa and Brazil aren't far behind. If the United States doesn't get on board with that new fourth industrial revolution technology, it will be left behind. This is the great reset that could happen, is if the world reserve currency is no longer the US dollar and it's a multipolar world, there will be a lot more equity in the world as far as the world economy is concerned, but without reliance upon the US dollar, all the US has to fall back on is its military strength. And what do countries do when their economy is in the tank? They start a war. And sometimes it becomes a world war. And that could also be a pretty big, great reset, right? World War I was also called the Great War. The Great Reset could be preceded by a great war, a third world war with nuclear weapons. I'm not saying it's going to happen, it's just a possibility. Let's continue. We'll jump to page 78. And Mr. Schwab wrote, this is under Societal Reset. It is, of course, much too early to depict with any degree of accuracy the form that the societal reset will take in different countries, but some of its broad global contours can already be delineated. First and foremost, the post-pandemic era will usher in a period of massive wealth redistribution, from the rich to the poor and from capital to labor. Second, COVID-19 is likely to sound the death knell of neoliberalism, a corpus of ideas and policies that can loosely be defined as favoring competition over solidarity, creative destruction over government intervention, and economic growth over social welfare. For a number of years, the neoliberal doctrine has been on the wane, with many commentators, business leaders, and policymakers increasingly denouncing its market fetishism. But COVID-19 brought the coup de grace. It is no coincidence that the two countries that over the past few years embraced the policies of neoliberalism with much fervor, the US and the UK, are among those that suffered the most casualties during the pandemic. These two concomitant forces, massive redistribution on the one hand and abandoning neoliberal policies on the other, will exert a defining impact on our society's organization, ranging from how inequalities could spur social unrest to the increasing role of governments and the redefinition of social contracts. Okay, now he's saying COVID-19 ushered in the death of neoliberalism, which is a nice way of saying capitalism, right? That's basically what it means. It means policies defined by favoring competition over solidarity, creative destruction, he decides to say, over government intervention, and economic growth over social welfare. That sounds like an oxymoron. Economic growth has social welfare as a byproduct. Always has, always will. He's saying COVID-19, this could bring the death knell of neoliberalism, and we're concerned more about social welfare and solidarity. In other words, we're back to the collectivism talk, right? COVID-19 will create a great reset, killing off neoliberalism, which had its foothold in the US and the UK. And he's saying, well, it's no coincidence that the US and the UK were the hardest hit by COVID because that's where neoliberalism has its home. But maybe if we create a new system that is anti-neoliberal and is more collective and concerned with social solidarity, this will heal the wounds of COVID-19 and we can move forward with a new social contract. It's basically saying, hey, COVID-19 was bad, but it was the worst in capitalist countries. It was the worst in countries that preserve the rights of the individual over the collective. So maybe it's time the collective has its day in these neoliberal countries. And again, he's ushering you towards the door of collectivism, socialism, communism. That's where it leads. That's where that road will go. Collectivism, socialism, last room on the left is communism. Okay, continuing. Page 86. At the time of writing this book, COVID-19 has already unleashed a global wave of social unrest. It started with the U.S. in the Black Lives Matter protests following the killing of George Floyd at the end of May 2020, but it rapidly spread around the world. COVID-19 was a determining element. George Floyd's death was the spark that lit the fire of social unrest. But the underlying condition created by the pandemic, in particular the racial inequalities that it laid bare and the rising level of unemployment, were the fuel that amplified the protests and kept them going. How? Over the past 6 years, nearly 100 African Americans have died in police custody, but it took the killing of George Floyd to trigger a national uprising. Therefore, it is not by chance that this outburst of anger occurred during the pandemic that has disproportionately affected U.S. African American communities. At the end of June of 2020, the mortality rate inflicted by COVID-19 on Black Americans was 2.4 times higher than for white Americans. Simultaneously, employment among Black Americans was being decimated by the corona crisis. All right, I'll stop right here because I can't let this passage go on without chiming in here. The George Floyd protests, I remember watching on the news, as I'm sure you all did, had nothing to do with COVID-19. What they had to do was, what was going on in the country was all of these police incidents with Black suspects were being spotlighted. And the media had a narrative. If any person was resisting arrest or possibly was subject to excessive force, that was because the United States police forces are systemically racist. That's the only explanation, right? Spotlighting these individual occurrences, and in particular, George Floyd, because it was all caught on camera. He says 100 African Americans have died in police custody. I can tell you for a fact that more white Americans are subject to lethal force by police departments every year without exception. So why was this amplified in 2020? Well, you had everybody who were locked down at home and nobody had anything to do. And it was summertime, right? The weather's better. It's nice to be outside. The sun is up longer. Well, how about we instigate riots around the country and we use the death of this man as a flashpoint for those riots. We create the conditions of social unrest by spotlighting these things in the media, and then once enough people believe that narrative, we let them run wild. And they burn down cities, and they loot Walmarts and Targets for the sake of justice, right? What would you do if you thought there was racial injustice in police departments? Would you protest at police departments? Would you demand your mayor and your governor do something about it? Or would you smash in some guy's store window and steal his goods? Of those three options, what would you do, right? The 2020 riots were just that. It was smash and grab, mayhem and looting. It had nothing to do with justice. It had nothing to do with George Floyd. It was just like, we're locked down, people don't have work, let's go break stuff and steal stuff. Because the media is telling us that we basically have license to do that. That was a socially engineered color revolution. And look up that term if you don't know what it means. But that was a color revolution because at the end of 2020, what was coming up? A presidential election. And nothing whets the appetite of the media more than social unrest, especially if it's racial social unrest prior to a presidential election. And if you don't believe me, look up the 1968 Democratic Convention. All of that stuff was replaying again. And it was in the middle of a pandemic, right? There were people running around, burning down Wendy's, smashing in cars, tipping over police vehicles. And nobody was wearing masks, right? Nobody was socially distancing. The media completely dropped that narrative for those few months because the bigger narrative was racial inequality, systemic racism in police departments, and mayhem. And nothing sells on the news better than sex and death. And in this case, it was death. It was insane. And I remember watching those news broadcasts, waiting to hear what they thought this would mean for the pandemic. Is this going to make things worse? It almost never came up. It almost never came up that, well, you've got all these people outside congregating in groups of dozens, if not hundreds. Isn't this going to circulate the pandemic even worse now? That was so far gone a thought that it didn't even register. And that's when I knew that this narrative was essentially being spoon-fed to the people. COVID-19 is bad. Stay home, get a vaccine. Okay, now there are race riots. Okay, well, race riots are a thing now. And this can take a back seat for a minute. But pandemics don't take a back seat, do they? Like, they're always there. You were being fed two narratives, one after the other, and none of it made sense. And that's why this great reset is so important to the World Economic Forum and men like Klaus Schwab. They constantly have to keep you in a state of desperation. It's a pandemic. It's systemic racism. It's a cyber attack. And that's coming next, right? At the World Economic Forum, I watched this one clip. They're already talking about the next COVID-19, possibly years down the road, but they're forecasting a large, possibly worldwide cyber attack that will be linked to some terrorist organization or might be state actors, but that's the next big catastrophe and it's coming soon. So get ready for it because they're already talking about it. That was a joke, right? It was like, well, they're talking about a cyber attack. I guess that's coming, right? Because they were talking about a pandemic a couple years before 2020 and we saw what happened with that. So are these all pre-planned events? Are these all pre-planned catastrophes to usher you into a great reset? And is this book kind of like the roadmap for that? Is this kind of like his way of, wink, wink, nudge, nudge? Is like, I wrote about it, so don't say we didn't warn you. All right, continuing. Page 87. This should not come as a surprise. The economic and social divide between African Americans and white Americans is so profound, according to almost every metric, black workers are disadvantaged compared to white workers. In May 2020, unemployment among African Americans stood at 16.8% versus the national level of 13.3%. A very high level that feeds into a phenomenon described by sociologists as biographical availability. The absence of full-time employment tends to increase the participation level in social movements. We do not know how the Black Lives Matter movement will evolve and if it persists, what form it will take. However, indications show it is turning into something broader than race-specific issues. The protests against systemic racism have led to more general calls about economic justice and inclusiveness. This is a logical segue to the issues of inequality addressed in the previous sub-chapter, which also illustrates how risks interact with each other and amplify one another. It is important to emphasize that no situation is set in stone and there are no mechanical triggers for social unrest. It remains an expression of a collective human dynamic and frame of mind that is dependent upon a multitude of factors. True to the notions of interconnectedness and complexity, outbursts of social unrest are quintessential nonlinear events that can be triggered by a broad variety of political, economic, societal, technological, and environmental factors. They range from things as different as economic shocks, hardship caused by extreme weather events, racial tension, food scarcity, and even sentiments of unfairness. All of these almost always interact with each other and create cascading effects. Therefore, specific situations of turmoil cannot be forecasted, but can, however, be anticipated. Which countries are most susceptible? At first glance, poor countries with no safety nets and rich countries with weak social safety nets are most at risk because they have no or fewer policy measures like unemployment benefits to cushion the shock of income loss. For this reason, strongly individualistic societies like the US could be at more risk than European or Asian countries that either have a greater sense of solidarity, like in Southern Europe, or a broader social system for assisting the underprivileged, like in Northern Europe. Sometimes the two come together. Countries like Italy, for example, possess both a strong social safety net and a strong sense of solidarity, particularly in intergenerational terms. In a similar vein, the Confucianism prevalent in so many Asian countries places a sense of duty and generational solidarity before the individual rights. It also puts high value on measures and rules that benefit the community as a whole. All this does not mean, of course, that European or Asian countries are immune from social unrest. Far from it. As the Yellow Vest movement demonstrates in the case of France, violent and sustained forms of social unrest can erupt even in countries endowed with a robust social safety net, but where social expectations are left wanting. Social unrest negatively affects both economic and social welfare, but it is essential to emphasize that we are not powerless in the face of potential social unrest, for the simple reason that governments, and to lesser extent companies and other organizations, can prepare to mitigate the risk by enacting the right policies. The greatest underlying cause of social unrest is inequality. The policy tools to fight unacceptable levels of inequality do not exist, and they often lie in the hands of government. Okay. The policy tools to fight unacceptable levels of inequality do exist, and they often lie in the hands of governments. I meant to say do exist, right? He's saying the government can fix it, right? Listen, if there are unacceptable levels of inequality, the government has the tools to fix this. There's a famous quote, I think it's by either Socrates or Plato, or Aristotle. I think Plato. I'll put it up. But it says, there is no greater inequality in this world than to take two things that are unequal and make them equal. He's basically saying forced equality. Collectivism, communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. To take two unequal things and to make them equal is what he's saying is in the power of governments to do. And he's right. It is in their power to do that. And what it creates is degrowth, atrophy. It creates a depression in people that lasts generations. If they understand that they are forced into a system of equality, they have no motivation to improve their lot in life. Because what's the point if everything's going to be equal? Why would I work harder if I'm going to be paid the same as my coworkers, right? Why should I take care of myself if we're all going to have access to the same health care, right? Oh, I should be healthy. Why? I can just go get free health care. Why don't I just live the way I want to live and just have access to the health care? It removes this incentive, which is inherent in the human being, to improve his lot in life, which by extension improves the lot in life for everybody. That is the collective you don't see. If everybody is pursuing their own individual interests based upon their own abilities, their own talent, their own intelligence, and is in fair competition with everybody, then they will raise the standard of living for everybody as a direct result. This social unrest, this social inequality, this is the great reset that the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab wants to happen. They want to essentially take the Western world, because they really don't care about the Eastern world right now, because the Eastern world is ready-made for this. The Western world, with its individualism, its capitalism, its neoliberalism, if you want to call it that, that is the problem. And for a global great reset to occur, they have to break these societies down. And what's the best way to do it? Create social division, create the conditions of economic, racial, religious, cultural, and linguistic diversity, and then foment this idea that if one person does better than the other, it's because of racism. It's because of, social inequality, economics, right? They're getting more money than you because, well, they do something that gets them more money. But that's unfair because your family or you can't personally partake in that. So there's social inequality by economics. And if we can't explain it through that, well, it's like, well, they're getting more than you because they're white or they're Asian or whatever. You create this division, you create this social conflict cauldron, and when it bubbles over, the Great Reset is what you bring in place. And you clear the deck, you level the playing field, and you usher in this Fourth Industrial Revolution, technocratic, communist model. And that's how we avoid things like COVID-19, right? We'll all be sick together, but we'll all get better together too. You have to, because you have no choice. Okay, moving on. Jump to page 93. Klaus wrote, looking to the future, governments will most likely, but with different degrees of intensity, decide that it's in the best interest of society to rewrite some of the rules of the game and permanently increase their role. as happened in the 1930s in the US when massive unemployment and economic insecurity were progressively addressed by the larger role of government. Today, a similar course of action is likely to characterize the foreseeable future. We review in other subchapters the form this will take, like in the next one on the new social contract, but let's briefly identify some of the most salient points. Health and unemployment insurance will either need to be created from scratch or strengthened where it already exists. Social safety nets will need to be strengthened as well. In the Anglo-Saxon societies that are the most market-oriented, extended unemployment benefits, sick leave, and many other social measures will have to be implemented to cushion the effect of the shock and will thereafter become the norm. In many countries, renewed trade union engagement will facilitate this process. Shareholder value will become a secondary consideration, bringing to the fore the primacy of stakeholder capitalism. The financialization of the world that gained so much traction in past years will probably go into reverse. Governments, particularly in the countries most affected by it, the US and UK, will be forced to reconsider many features of this obsession with finance. They could decide on a broad range of measures, from making share buybacks illegal to preventing banks from incentivizing consumer debt. The public scrutiny of private companies will increase, particularly for all the businesses that benefited from public money. Some countries will nationalize, while others will prefer to take equity stakes or to provide loans. In general, there will be more regulation covering many different issues, such as workers' safety or domestic sourcing for certain goods. Businesses will also be held to account on social and environmental fractures for which they will be expected to be part of the solution. As an add-on, governments will strongly encourage public-private partnerships so that private companies get more involved in the mitigation of global risks. Irrespective of the details, the role of the state will increase, and in so doing will materially affect the way business is conducted. To varying degrees, business executives in all industries and all countries will have to adapt to greater government intervention. Research and development for global public goods, such as health and climate change solutions, will be actively pursued. Taxation will increase, particularly for the most privileged, because governments will need to strengthen their resilience capabilities and wish to invest more heavily in them. As advocated by Joseph Stiglitz, the first priority is to provide more funding for the public sector, especially for those parts that are designed to protect against the multitude of risks that a complex society faces, and to fund the advances in science and higher quality education on which our future prosperity depends. These are areas in which productive jobs, researchers, teachers, and those who help run the institutions that support them can be created quickly. Even as we emerge from this crisis, we should be aware that some other crisis surely lurks around the corner. We can't predict what the next one will look like, other than it will look different from the last. Nowhere will this intrusion of governments, whose form may be benign or malign, depending on the country and the culture in which it is taking place, manifests itself with greater vigor than in the redefinition of the social contract. Okay, there we go, right? All that was old will be new again. I'll underline this part here. As an add-on, governments will strongly encourage public-private partnerships so that private companies get more involved in the mitigation of global risks. That's a nice way of saying socialism. That is the definition of socialism. That is the government getting involved in the private sector to the point where the private sector essentially has to get on board to address global risks like climate change. And there's going to be more taxation for the most privileged, right? Yeah, people who have money are privileged. They don't work hard. They don't earn it. They're privileged. So we're just going to take more of their stuff and we're going to redistribute it. And the government's going to work with the private companies to make sure the distribution is equitable. And this will be the new social contract. All that was old will be new again. We're going to try to reinvent the wheel here. And this time socialism is going to work. We're going to do a great reset. And it's going to be socialism for most of the civilized world. And it's been tried. Socialism has been tried. It was tried in 1930s Germany. It was tried in post-World War II Russia. It was tried in China. China, I guess, is still working on it, but it's definitely more private sector than it's ever been. So even China has essentially admitted that the socialist model has failed. And socialism, without question, always leads to communism. Why? Because the private sector is beholden to the government, always, right? The private sector has to follow the rules that the government lays down. So if the government intrudes upon the private sector, what happens without fail? That role in the private sector gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and before you know it, it's total. And you have communism. It's no longer socialism, it's communism, right? It's like socialism is like the cocoon and communism is the butterfly. Once the cocoon is made, the natural process takes over and the butterfly emerges, and it's communism. I hate to compare communism to a butterfly because one's beautiful and one's ugly, but that's how it works. Once the cocoon is made and the caterpillar goes inside, it's a done deal. What comes out will be communism. That cocoon is socialism. And it doesn't sound so bad from the get-go. It's kind of like Keynesian economics, but this is what he's talking about, the new social contract, right? This will create a socialist model. It's kind of ironic that a guy who was born in 1930s Germany is proposing this, but on a global scale now. It's like, all right, listen, the whole National Socialist Party thing in Germany, yeah, that was not so great. Yeah, we didn't really stick the landing on that one. But hey, I got an idea for a socialist model, but it'll be worldwide, and this time it's going to work. It has to, right? All right, last reading. Here we go. If you're still with me, God bless you. Okay, we jump to page 117. And Mr. Schwab takes us out with this reading. In the case of the pandemic, in contrast with other recent global crises like 9/11 or the financial crisis of 2008, the global governance system failed, proving either non-existent or dysfunctional. The U.S. went on to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization, but no matter the underlying rationale of this decision, the fact remains that it is the only organization capable of coordinating a global response to the pandemic, which means that, albeit far from perfect, the WHO is infinitely preferable to a non-existent one. An argument Bill Gates compellingly and succinctly made in a tweet. Their work is slowing the spread of COVID-19. And if that work is stopped, no other organization can replace them. The world needs the World Health Organization now more than ever. This failure is not the WHO's fault. The UN agency is merely the symptom, not the cause, of global governance failure. The WHO's deferential posture towards donor countries reflects its complete dependence on states agreeing to cooperate with it. The UN organization has no power to compel information sharing or enforce pandemic preparedness. Like other similar UN agencies, for example, on human rights or climate change, the WHO is saddled with limited and dwindling resources. In 2018, it had an annual budget of $4.2 billion, minuscule in comparison to any health budget around the world. In addition, it is at the perpetual mercy of member states and has effectively no tools at its disposal to directly monitor outbreaks, coordinate pandemic planning, or ensure effective preparedness implementation at the country level, let alone allocate resources to those countries most in need. This dysfunctionality is symptomatic of a broken global governance system, and the jury is out as to whether existing global governance configurations like the UN and the WHO can be repurposed to address today's global risks. For the time being, the bottom line is this. In the face of such a vacuum in global governance, only nation states that are cohesive enough to be capable of taking collective decisions, but this model doesn't work in the case of world risks that require concerted global decisions. The world will be a very dangerous place if we do not fix multilateral institutions. Global coordination will be even more necessary in the aftermath of the epidemiological crises, for it is inconceivable that the global economy could restart without sustained international cooperation. Without it, we'll be heading towards a poorer, meaner, and smaller world. Good God, no. All right, so we wrap up this part with talk about the World Health Organization, the WHO. We have the benefit of hindsight now. It's 2023. The World Health Organization, the CDC, the NHS, they all screwed up, like on every step of the way. Like why do you want us to believe, Mr. Schwab, why do you want us to believe in the UN and the World Health Organization when we essentially went with their plan? We went with the CDC's plan, the WHO's plan, and they sucked. Like, they called it wrong. The pandemic took over the world, which was inevitable, but everything we did in response to it was like shooting ourselves in the foot over and over again. Let's shut down the economy. Let's give people free money, okay? Let's create a vaccine before we get through all the clinical trials. Let's give it to kids. Okay, none of that worked. Okay, the vaccine was ineffective. Okay, the vaccine is showing some serious side effects. We weren't here. Why would we trust the World Health Organization, which, by the way, is getting $4.2 billion a year to do what? Make recommendations? Like, where's that money coming from? It's coming from the US, of course, but like, why would we trust world organizations, world government organizations like the UN when something like COVID-19, a pandemic, can't be stopped? And there's nothing that they could have possibly done to have mitigated it. In fact, the countries that just let it run its course, ironically enough, we find like they fared the best. That just ignored it and said, well, you know, it's going to come, it's going to go, and we'll get through it. People will die, people will live, and people will be born. And that's just life. Without it, we'll be in a smaller, poorer, and meaner world. Meaning, if you don't get on board with the collective, if you don't join this thing we call humanity on a global scale, well, you want us to live in a poor, mean world, in a small world. I think COVID-19, more than anything, showed us that as a country, you are on your own. And honestly, the only thing you really could have done for your country that would have benefited you in the COVID-19 pandemic is quarantining yourself from the rest of the world. As in, all of our citizens abroad are going to be quarantined for 1 month, like on a ship somewhere off our coast or at our border. If they're cleared and they're healthy, they get admission. Nobody from a foreign country is allowed in. Nobody's allowed to travel out. That's the only way you can really save yourself from what is essentially going to be a pandemic. But even those measures are kind of foolhardy because all it takes is 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people getting in, and then those people infect 5 people, those 5 people affect 25 people, those 25 infect 100, those 100 infect 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and then it's, who cares? Like, whatever, it's over. It's like it's in your population. Whatever it does, it's going to do, and it's going to run its course regardless of anything you try to do in the meantime. And that's what we have to accept about these things. There is no global solution. There is no collective organization that we're all going to sign up for that's going to prevent these things or make it any better for us. All those organizations are going to do is going to do what organizations like that have done since the beginning of human history. They're going to plan things in secret. They're going to present you a program in public. And once you accept it, they will consolidate all of that power you grant them. And they will never let it go. And they will just seek to create new plans in secret, new public policies, and more consolidation. And that's how it works. That's how it's always worked. And there's nothing new under the sun as it pertains to this. But it's fun to read about, it's fun to discuss, and I hope you got something out of this one. Okay, that'll do it for part 2. We're back in action. It's been a while, but I'm glad to see you here. I looked at the old video for the first part, and 129 views in the last month and a half, which, as I said, it obviously means the video is getting shadow banned. It's getting suppressed because I'm saying words like Klaus and Schwab and World Economic Forum and COVID-19 and vaccine and pandemic and all these naughty words you're not allowed to say. But if we don't have the ability to express our thoughts, we don't have freedom, okay? So I'm going to say what I got to say. I'm going to choose the words I choose to use. And if they get suppressed, if they get censored, well, that's the way it goes. At least I got it out there. So if you folks could do me a favor, give us a thumbs up. If you're liking the channel, give us a subscribe. Share it with family or friends if you think they would get something out of this video or others like it. And we will wrap it up for this part 2 of COVID-19, the Great Reset, and pick it up for part 3. As I said, I'm going to do 2 more parts. So this will be halfway mark. We'll do parts 3 and 4 for this book. So until then, I hope you had a good rest because I did. But we'll see you back here for next time. Till then, take it easy.